Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for our webinar about the results of our latest survey that we have been doing. We have a great panel to help us discuss the results of that. But before that, I'd like to just give you a little bit about how we got here and what was the intention of the whole operation. So you may or may not be familiar with the museum expert, but and I'm not going to do the history of the whole organization so far, but over the last months, we have been trying to become more practical and intentional in the work that we are doing. So far, we had found a number of things happening in the professional field of museums that we wanted to explore further because it looks like there are some issues that are unsolved for many, many years, maybe, but that are probably because of COVID being more visible over the last months. And so after trying to help people building fulfilling careers by going back into the museum field after COVID, we found that there was a lot of discomfort in the field, that many people who worked in the museum field were burned out, or they felt totally not in the right place, or had questions about the engagement that they had with this initial profession that they had. And everybody seemed to be pointing fingers to others to say what that is. So we had both webinars up so far with professionals explaining why the burnout, what they were uncomfortable with, why they felt that they were not enough associated with the future of their organization, and other meetings where CEOs explained that they had still a large problem getting back on their feet financially, and also were struggling with the new and forms of professional practices that were appearing everywhere, such as hybrid working and things of that sort. So despite the fact that everybody said we are trying to work together, our feeling was that that was not necessarily the case, and that there was a real, like a sort of a barrier, or many barriers, that prevented people to work in the museum as a community, or to put it in the words of one of our panelists today, that there was not such a thing as a human-centered workplace in the museum field. So our intention was, let's explore that. Let's find out what the barriers are to that situation, and maybe after that we can come up with a number of solutions or recommendations of what people could do to improve that. So we had a survey based on, there was only one question, and that is, which of these 20 barriers are the most important to you? And these 20 barriers, we selected them from different webinars, from chats, from individual conversations, and from a focus group that we have done offsite to be able to make that list. And so that was simple. This is the 20 that we came up with. Maybe there are more than that, but which are, according to you, the most important ones? And then, in addition to that, what is your position in the museum? And so we arbitrarily and so created a sort of a selection of what the categories were. We didn't want to have like 25 or 40 because that wouldn't make sense. We wanted to have a limited number of categories of professions so that the results would become significant at the end. So that is where we stand today. We'll share with you the results, but before doing that, I'd like to have you meeting with the panel, and we'll ask every person in the panel to present themselves, and then tell also in what regard they think they relate to the topic of today. So I'm going to start on top of my screen, which is Anne Ackerson. Anne, would you like to introduce yourself and then also tell us how you relate to this topic?
Thank you. Thank you, Walter. I'm delighted to be here today with all of you. I've spent a long time in the museum field, many decades, And I come to you today, currently serving on the American Association for State and Local History's Gender Discrimination Sexual Harassment Task Force, which is the result of my working on a national survey on this topic that was fielded in 2020 and 2021 by the National Council on Public History and the American Association for State and Local History. Additionally, my interest in gender issues in the museum workforce stem from the book that I co-wrote with Joan Baldwin called Women in the Museum, Lessons from the Workplace, which was published in 2017 by Routledge. I'm also a co-founder of the Gender Equity in Museums movement, also known as GEM. And I just received a GEM newsletter either earlier this week or late last week. And they're talking about sort of the group's emphasis for the coming few months. And if you'll indulge me, I just want to read a couple of sentences from that newsletter, because I think it sort of gets to the crux of what we're talking about here today. And they wrote that, quote, "We want to challenge our institutions to rethink the integrity of our work by acknowledging how our policies and entrenched ideologies contribute to a culture that hinders women, non-binary, and BIPOC individuals from entering the field, from leading the field, and from staying in the field. Each non-inclusive policy enacted, each inflexible belief system tolerated, incrementally diminishes the museum's significance and our ability to remain relevant to the communities that we aim to serve." I thought that was quite prescient for today. So thank you for indulging me on that. So that gives you kind of a little bit of a nutshell of, I think, why I'm here and how I might add to the conversation.
It certainly does. Thank you so much. Micah, same thing, same question to you.
Great, thanks, Walter. And thank you so much to Museum Expert for gathering this data. I think that will be so helpful to all of us in the field. And thank all of you for prioritizing this webinar today. This is sort of the most intractable, challenging issue relative to the sustainability of our field, I think, and the fact that you're here says a lot about you. So thank you for making that effort. My name is Micah Parzen. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Museum of Us, formerly the San Diego Museum of Man. And over the last 10 plus years or so, we've really worked towards building better and better practices in what an anti-racist museum can look like, what a decolonial museum can look like. And we've really tried to do that from the inside out. So our workplace culture has been a major focus of our work, and I'm convinced is really a key to the progress we've been able to make in these very, very difficult spaces that are so challenging for all of us to sort of navigate as museum professionals, no matter where we're positioned in the field. My background is twofold as an anthropologist and a psychological anthropologist in particular, so very conversant in human-centered ethnography and work along those lines. But I also worked as an employment attorney for many years, and I represented corporate and nonprofit clients navigating difficult employee issues and trying to be compliant with the law and avoid claims and litigation and the like, and drafted hundreds of policies and procedures and handbooks. And, you know, one of the things I really brought from those years of experience was that those policies, procedures, and handbooks are not really designed to create healthy workplace cultures that are human-centered and really put the needs and concerns and interests of our teams at the core. To the contrary, they're often designed to sort of CYA the employer. And ironically, that often leads to a very dysfunctional kind of us versus them workplace, where you see the very claims and lawsuits that ostensibly we're all trying to avoid. So I really took both my anthropological training and my training as an employment attorney and sort of pieced together all the parts, connected all the dots to sort of look at our own organization at the Museum of Us and how can we begin to carve out something very different that really is human-centered and kind of from the inside out creates a very healthy inside that then can serve the public in a very healthy way as well. And that's been a major focus. We actually have a pending IMLS National Leadership Grant as we speak, waiting to hear if we're going to get funding for a project we're calling Sharing Our Human-Centered Workplace Practices Will Uplift Us All. And the idea is that so many of us are engaging in sometimes small, sometimes medium-sized, sometimes large shifts along these lines. And we all have a lot to learn from each other. And the more we sort of come together to share those kinds of resources in contexts like this, the better chance we have of catalyzing what I would call a human-centered turn in the museum field. So really thrilled to be here today with these wonderful colleagues and with Museum Expert, and looking forward to the discussion of the data.
Okay. Thank you, Micah. And finally, Laura Lott, that probably most of you know, but still, Laura, please introduce yourself and same question to you.
Thanks, Walter. And I'll just add my thanks to Museum Expert for hosting this really important conversation. I do feel it's central to museums and museum people's ability to thrive in this field. So it's great that we are talking about it and looking at some data to chart a path forward. I'm Laura Lott. I am currently the Administrator and Chief Operating Officer at the National Gallery of Art here in Washington, D.C. I spent the last 13 years prior to joining the gallery last summer as the President and CEO of the American Alliance of Museums. I think I am here because this is a passion of mine. I've been a lifelong student of organizational culture and of equity and did a lot of DEI work, of course, at AAM, both internally at the American Alliance of Museums and our staff, and on behalf of the field as well. So glad to be here today.
Thank you so much, Laura. So it's time now, and before I'm going to the results, I just want to make sure that everyone knows you can ask your questions in the chat at the end of this session. We will trying to answer these as much as we can. So maybe it's now time to go and to the results of our survey, and maybe we can pull up the PowerPoint now. I will comment on the, yeah. All right, so this is the first thing. We had 562 answers. We stopped it at some point, so we had to, we could have more, but 562 is the final number. And here is the distribution based on the position that people said they had in the museum. So you can see we have very little board members, but for 22% about of executive and senior staff. We have 22% management as well. 15% about frontline workers, and then what we call staff not frontline, 24%. Some people out of the museum field, so there's a misspelling there, also answered, and then we have a quite an important group of consultants. So this is the picture of people who have answered. So a large group of executive, senior staff, frontline and management, and staff not frontline is the major one. So the next slide. The next slide is actually the result, the global result of all the answers. And when we look at that, we see that the number one reason, the number one barrier by the total answers is we have always done it that way attitude. So that's what most of, from 241, there's 42% of the answers. We know this. The second one is a disconnect between the leaders and the daily practice, the daily work in the museums. Third, the idea that we are still stuck in survival mode, that the COVID crisis is not over, and that we still need to to make sure that we can only be open and do the minimum to get through this. Fourth, the lack of diverse perspectives within museums. So this is something that Laura just mentioned earlier. Then also a very important one is that we look mostly for a quick fix rather than a long-term sustainable solution, because that means, of course, other types of investments, I guess. And six, I feel that the feel and the weight of the hierarchy that is important. So that is something that works paralyzing in the museums. So we have done it that way. There is a disconnect with the daily work. We are still in survival mode. We are looking for quick fixes, etc. So these are the main answers for the general global answer that we have. So the next slide, now we're going to distribute that. So when we look at the answers from the executive and senior staff, that is not necessarily the same as this global picture. Although we have always done it that way, is actually the biggest answer in this one. And secondly, we are looking for quick fixes rather than long-term sustainable solutions. Third, we are still in survival mode, but also the idea that there is a lack of transparency in what it is that they do, and the fact that they cannot or they do not take into account external elements in the field that are of the museum field that should help analyze the way forward. So that's a very significant answer here in a clear direction. We have always done it that way, and we are still stuck in this survival mode, and we are looking for quick fixes rather than sustainable long-term solutions. The next one. The management is then what we consider just like under the senior staff, and the idea there that is the most prevalent is that we looking at the answer is the quick fix, not looking at sustainable solutions on the long term, that we are stuck in survival mode. The lack of transparency comes also very strongly there, and you can imagine management people that have to implement certain policies. They may be having some frustrations about why they are doing things, and also hierarchy is paralyzing. They feel it as well. So management that is not the leadership, but just beyond that, feels quick fix rather than long-term solutions. We are still stuck in survival mode, but there is also lack of transparency, and the hierarchy is paralyzing, is the most significant answers here. Next one. This is staff, not frontline workers, and there we have recognized that also we have always done it that way, and the quick fix is also very strong here. The other answers come with less numbers, with the pat on the back and the survival mode and lack of transparency. But here very strongly the feeling that we have done it we always have done it that way is significant, and also the quick fix type of attitude. Next one. The frontline workers is more complex, but very, very significant as well, and very different from what we have heard so far. Frontline workers, they find in the first place that the hierarchy is paralyzing. They feel that the leadership is tries too much to please the board rather than the staff of the museum. That museums are stuck in survival mode, that there is a lack of transparency. So it's very important to see that the difference between frontline workers, the way they approach that, although they recognize that there is, that we are stuck in survival mode, that they recognize that. But more important to them is that hierarchy is paralyzing, and that there is a feeling that the workers in the museum are not as important as the board members. Next. And here we isolated here the consultants as well, because they seem to be addressing the things both from the senior side and from the side of the staff. They say always done that way. That's what they feel the museums are looking now. They still do it. They're looking at the quick fix, lack of transparency, but they bring something else to the table, which is really the role of consultants. I would say there is no eye for external elements. So consultants, from my experience as well, they don't look to the museums as an isolated institution, but they look also to what's going on in society and how that necessarily needs to influence the museum and the decisions that they make. And so it's not a surprise that they actually come up with this as an important barrier, that and it may be the same as stuck in the survival mode, or we have always done it that way, but the fact that we are not looking to outside the museum it's seen by the consultants as a barrier. I think that that's all the tables that we wanted to show. Yeah, so that. So museum expert doesn't feel that they are experts necessarily in all of these things. So that's why we have brought these panels together. And so our first round of comments is going to go about this data that they have seen before, of course. And so I'm going to ask each of them to give a first impression about what they just have seen. So maybe Laura, do you want to start?
Sure, thanks, Walter. I think the data, and both where there are some common ground and where there are some apparent disconnects is really not surprising to me. I think we see this a lot, but indicates why it's so important that we have these conversations and focus on as much as possible when we have them in our institutions as well, hopefully, on the active listening part. I think one of my biggest concerns when I was leading AM was the disconnect between the leadership of museums and the workers of museums. And when people ask me what kept me up at night, it was how do we bring this field together and those kind of two different roles in institutions, because there are truths all the way around, and there are pressures, obviously, that that leaders have that I think maybe staff don't have insight into, and vice versa. And so the more that we're able to have conversations about this and really hear each other, I think the better. I know in reading some of the comments that you didn't present, Walter, but that are also really
for later.
Oh, for later. Okay.
But let's just look at the data as it appears, and as I feel, maybe it's something that we know, but there really is different views between different people in different levels in the museums about what they think are the barriers to a human-centered workplace. And so let's see if that is something that inspires some thoughts.
Yeah.
That's also about the differences in answers between the different.
Yeah, I think one of the things that stuck out to me is the, looking for a quick fix is one of the things that shows up on, I think, every or almost every group's top 5 reasons. And, that to me is a lot of our work is about finding a problem, especially leaders, right? Finding a problem, fixing it, and then moving on to the next thing. And culture work is never like that. And culture work in the kind of environment that we're living and working in right now, it's a tough time, right? There's no doubt. During the pandemic, now after the pandemic, after the worst of it is over, we're left with a lot of stressors, a lot of division in our country and around the world, a lot of mental health concerns, a lot of isolation and and loneliness among people. And so it's a really tough environment, and there isn't ever going to be a quick fix, and the work is never going to be done. And so the recognition that, recognition that, we can't just look for a quick fix that will suddenly make our workplaces more human-centered and more equitable, I think is a really important one.
Thank you. Anne, your thoughts about the raw data?
Yeah, I agree with everything Laura said, and I'll just add that I think that the list, particularly the top 5, are all somewhat related, and they're related to what I would characterize as a scarcity mentality that has taken hold of the nonprofit sector generally, and the cultural portion of that sector particularly. And of course, you're going to revert to the quick fix because you're in survival mode. And I also want to say that there are a lot of museums, I think, that have been in survival mode well before the pandemic, maybe from the time of their founding. So this is the only way they know how to operate, is the quick fix, falling back on the tried and true, or what we've always done, and that sort of thing. And it would be interesting maybe to explore that a little bit more deeply. But I think that when you're in survival mode, you're not looking to experiment much, and this whole notion, as Laura touched upon, changing the culture takes time, and it does take resources, and it takes a shared vision for the institution, and all of that requires a tremendous commitment that a lot of institutions find difficult to sustain. I think that we're seeing that with a lot of DEAI work at the moment, that a lot of institutions have, come out, right after the George Floyd murder, and we're raring to go to make change, and they've backed off from it now. Sustaining these major issues is really hard, and they need help. They need help to do so. And I think as a field, we provide a lot of resources and information, but we're not providing them with what they really need to make it happen. And I would lay a lot of this at the feet of the boards of trustees, boards of directors, who are complicit with all of this. And we can talk more about that later. Yeah. But without their leadership on all of these issues, it's really, I'm sorry, that's my phone. It will stop in a moment. It's really difficult for institutional leaders and the rank and file to really make substantive change. So I'll stop there. Thank you,
Anne. Micah, maybe your thoughts on the raw data?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and a big plus one to both what Laura said and especially about how the importance of playing the long game here, and the role of our boards and setting the stage so that we can play the long game. I wonder if we can share sort of the global slide so just people can see those data again. Thank you, Colleen. I was really looking at this, and just to kind of add to what my colleagues shared, if you look at the most often cited barriers, the top 6 that are really, I think 30% or higher, there are some of those barriers that are structural in nature, and there are others that are cultural in nature. And so they're actually evenly split, sort of 3 and 3. And by structural, I would mean the barriers that are sort of deeply embedded into how we're organized as institutions. Some examples, I think, would be that we're too hierarchical and top heavy, that we're stuck in survival mode, meaning we're always trying to just get the next buck, and from a funding perspective, and so we can't think long term, or we're looking for that quick fix because we're sort of on this treadmill that's going so fast that we don't have time to really pause and again kind of think further out. Whereas the cultural barriers are ones that are really a byproduct of our organizational values and how those values get lived out in practice or not, as the case may be in our institutions. So the examples of those, I think, are probably, we've always done it that way. There's a disconnect between leadership and the daily reality of the work, or there's lack of diverse perspectives. And I think it's important to kind of distinguish between the types of barriers, because while they're both very difficult to overcome, I think that the cultural barriers are really about leadership. It's really about leadership's sort of saying, hey, just because we've always done it this way, we don't have to anymore. Or I don't want to be, my team and I to be disconnected from the daily work. Let's figure out what that looks like from an alternative perspective. Or lack of diverse perspectives. That's really about who's brought into the organization. And I think it's really important to sort of, I think you can start with the cultural shifts, and then the structural changes will sort of flow eventually out of those cultural shifts. I don't think you can start with structural shifts and then hope the culture will shift down the road. So something that I've been thinking about a lot with respect to this data. The other thing I would sort of just briefly touch on is kind of the issue of segmentation, and maybe we can show that next slide of how leadership, executive staff, you can see that leadership overwhelmingly is saying we've always done it that way. And the irony there is leaders have the power to change how we've always done it, right? But as Anne was saying, they also need the support of the board in order to sort of begin to engage in transformational. They need that sort of courage. I think we have to ask, why is it not shifting? Either leaders just aren't understanding that they have the ability to really change it, or they're not feeling supported in their ability to change. And if we could look at the forward-facing staff one, Colleen, that would be helpful. This one, yeah, this is the one. We see more of a distribution here, right? Two of them are structural, that are kind of leading the way, the hierarchical, the top heavy, the stuck in survival mode. But then two of them are cultural, the lack of transparency. Again, something within leaders' control to be more transparent. Leadership, of course, hardly saw this at all in the other graph, right? They hardly know, even that was barely a bump. And then also this issue of too focused on pleasing the board. Again, another cultural issue that leaders can do a lot to bring together the board and staff in ways that aren't haves and have-nots, create a team, albeit with different roles, but working in different sort of ways toward our common purpose, and educating the team about the role of the board and that they aren't making these big decisions. I mean, I think sometimes leaders throw their boards under the bus too, and sometimes that's very much the case, that the board is hamstringing. So, I mean, I think the bottom line is that it's really leadership is the key to these cultural shifts. Feels very consistent with sort of the experience we've had at the Museum of Us in terms of getting a board who's very supportive of this type of work in the long run, knowing that it's going to take time and can have some messy nonlinear steps along the way.
Yeah, thanks for that. And already looked a little bit ahead of what we will discuss a little bit later about steps forward. But thanks for that. For everyone listening, we will share the whole results with the field in the coming weeks. So if you have not been able to take note of the numbers and data, you will receive that so far. We have also asked an open question. We had a question about what is your priority, but the open question was about, did we miss something, and what is your opinion about that? Those were extremely rich, actually. Were the comments that came from the field. We had really enormous answers. And let me and I'm going to, of course, ask the panel to comment on them, because they saw this as well. But something that struck me when I looked at the comments coming from the executive staff is something intriguing that I did not expect, and maybe you can comment on that as well, and then give your full view on the rest. But from the executive staff, let's start with that. Many comments came in the field of, because we don't have enough money, we cannot actually have the staff that we like. And we actually cannot make, there are barriers in our institution because the staff is not performing. And I thought I did not expect that, honestly. So maybe, Micah, then we're going to go reverse. Micah, you start on that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little bit of a cop-out, quite honestly, by leaders. Yes, it's true, but it's all about priorities. I mean, the budget is a moral document in that sense, right? And it defines whether our priorities are, in fact, what we say they are. And so, I think part of the problem from that perspective, Walter, is that leaders tend to be under so much pressure to do more is more when it comes to public programs, when it comes to serving visitors, and it's all about the visitor. We have very visitor-centric organizations, but that very much comes at the cost of our staff, and we see this through this data through and through. So kind of shifting the sort of script a little bit, so that instead of more is always more externally, that more is more internally. And sometimes that means less has to be more externally. And it doesn't mean you won't get there, but if you don't start from the inside out, it's highly problematic. So, and we see that it's a short-term fix. It's not playing the long game. So, in terms of the specific issue you raised relative to kind of leadership pointing to funding, yes, and it's all about priorities, right? And sort of rebuilding our organizations through a different lens.
So, Laura, we're discussing now the comments from the executive leadership. So I gave one example, and thanks, Micah, to react to that. But maybe you can react on that as well, or maybe there are other things that you have noticed in the comments from the staff that stuck with you.
Yeah, what I was thinking about before, and it builds a little bit on what Micah just said, and the example that you gave, Walter, because it stuck out to me, is kind of the financial barriers, right? Both in terms of pay equity, which is across, I think, and acknowledged both in the executive leadership comments and also clearly coming through in some of the worker comments. Which, I agree with Micah, it's a prioritization issue. At one point at AAM, I had to we had to do a reduction in force, and I let a CFO go so that I could hire a chief diversity officer. And that, it was a big decision. And some of my board was not sure exactly what I was thinking about, but it made sense to me, and it ended up working out for us. But that's the kind of tough decisions that sometimes need to be made to prioritize the things that, we say we want to prioritize, and not falling into we have to do a little bit of everything trap, but really right sizing our budgets and staffs to, our work to our budgets and staffs, essentially right sizing our work to what we have to work with. And to me, it's all, and you're totally right. There was a 2016 report that showed more than a third of museums were operating in the red during that really good financial time, actually, pretty much, before the pandemic. And we're using, staff vacancies to plug budget holes, essentially. So sort of filling managing the budget on the backs of reduced staff numbers. That's been going on for a decade or more. Probably back to 2006, 2007 financial crisis, or maybe even longer than that, as nonprofits always stretch to provide service. But that's there's a massive sort of business model problem, I think, in the field that is the root of a lot of this, and I think it's directly tied to the boards in terms of how we. As a field, or how many museums, I would say, tend to think about their boards as fundraising boards versus governance or leadership or generative thinking boards who are really focused on culture. And until we kind of fix some of those structural problems related to the folks that we choose from our communities for our boards and how we ask them to lead, the business model problem and all of the other things that are wrapped up in it will continue to be a barrier in this area.
Thanks. And we're still discussing the comments from the CEOs, and it was already addressed here by Laura, the board, the relation with the board, and Micah also said it, but you did it in your introduction. Maybe you can come back on that if you have noticed any of that, but also on the question of diversity and inclusion. I have noticed as well that financial problems also is a sort of an argument to say, because of we have financial problems, we can actually not do really hire people that are the diverse workforce. So maybe from your perspective on that.
Well, I think that's right. I often ask myself and others, colleagues, are staff considered assets or liabilities? And I think that's a, kind of a core question. It's a value question. And it's a question that really needs to be answered institution-wide, because as we said, when times get tough, staff get cut, staff development gets cut. Many leaders look at staff as expendable during tough times. And I think during good times, they may tend to swing the pendulum quite the other way and try to overcompensate for that. I think that when I looked at the findings, the comments, I felt that, or the findings, I felt that there was, in fact, a lot of buck passing, that there was not a lot of agency among the people filling the survey out. They felt they had no agency to do much. And so that made me wonder, who is filling out this survey? Did it attract people who have an axe to grind? or did it attract people who are also have agency and are making change? And so their responses are showing up maybe in those smaller amounts. I don't really know. That's a kind of an interesting thing. But it does say to me that I think a lot of people feel their hands are tied. And so they'll, point the fingers at others. And I will also say, I will agree with Laura that this is a business model issue. This is it's a nonprofit. It's sector-wide. It's an issue of how nonprofits are established, how they're funded, how they're held accountable, the whole 9 yards. How, the board model, so far as I know, has not really changed in 150 years. And yes, there are, more legal ramifications and so forth around it, but those are huge issues, well beyond the museum sector. But I feel as though something's going to give.
And we probably do this more in, of course, and we don't have all the time in 1 hour to address everything. So let me now just to the other end and go to some comments that we got from the frontline workers and see how relevant they are. We already said that one of the things that they came up with is the pay, and that's really an issue that they feel that low salaries, they cannot give their best, and they, that's one thing. But another very important and met many examples was the lack of respect and value of the frontline staff. So there were so many people who made comments on that they didn't feel respected within the organization when they were. But maybe Laura, you can then, and then we go to Micah and then Anne.
Yeah, I'm not sure what to say about it, Walter. I think I saw that in the comments. I think I've heard that before, both frontline and even just non-management staff. I don't know if a lot of that comes from the recent really big layoffs that a lot of museums did, at the beginning of COVID, where people are still feeling like they were they were dispensable essentially, and therefore let go pretty quickly in some cases after the pandemic hit and museums started closing, and or if expectations for, are pretty high in terms of what would constitute respect. There is, I've often said to folks, equity, and this, I think the question is, what are these barriers to us being a more equitable organization, right? So that's what we're responding to here. Equity doesn't always mean everybody gets exactly what they want, when they want it, how they want it, which I think is sometimes what people come in thinking equity means. And so I think there is, as I started my comments, I think in introduction saying there's a real need for listening to each other, and what the real needs are, what the real challenges are, and then finding some areas of common ground to move forward.
Thank Micah, any thoughts on this very strong statements from frontline staff about the lack of respect?
Yeah, I mean, clearly the locus of the tension in our organizations is with respect to frontline staff, forward-facing staff, and leadership, and not that there aren't issues elsewhere as well, but you really see that in these comments. And Walter, you mentioned pay. And I think pay equity, while we know that that's not the only reason people leave organizations, but it is a very important one. I think a lot about Robert Reich's kind of famous quote that this is simple, people. Like, if you can't afford to pay your employees a living wage, you do not have a viable business model. And I think sort of starting as close to that as possible in this place where we're at, and beginning to kind of build from there, then is a real signifier, both practical and sort of representative, of respect and value in appreciating team members as assets and not as liabilities. We found at the Museum of Us that having a part-time, full-time model was also highly problematic, right? Because these part-time employees are never really fully integrated as first-class sort of citizens. They're always second-class, and it's very difficult to kind of create a culture that they feel as much a part of as anybody else. And so we actually eliminated part-time positions and brought in only full-time folks at a significantly higher wage that is gets closer to living wage in San Diego. But I think it's these kinds of steps, and then as Laura and Ann were saying, really sitting and listening to folks and where their pain points are, creating a space that's safe enough for them to share what they're really feeling and experiencing, and then trying to work together to address those pain points. I think then you start to see change and get away from these sorts of frustrations that so many forward-facing staff are experiencing.
Thank you. And maybe addressing then another point is that many of the frontline workers say that there is still a lot of discrimination within museums, whether it is older people, younger people, people with disabilities, etc., that is a very important barrier to a human-centered workplace. There is a lot of discrimination against all these groups.
Right. I mean, we've certainly seen that in just the gender work that Joan Baldwin and I did, and that now AASLH is working on, and what we've done with the technical leaflet, which I know Colleen will put the link to that chat. Yeah. AASLH is making that freely available to everyone, which is great.
So we only have an hour, so I feel that this is the beginning of a conversation about this results. We will share them with everybody, and then take other initiatives to discuss more in depth about that with at other occasions. But at this point, maybe all of you have some kind of ideas of what to recommend moving forward. I still have you on my screen, so go ahead.
Me?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think that as we've said, they're big issues, they're reoccurring issues. The needle has moved some, but not nearly enough or as much as it should or could. And I think what I would like to see is the various museum associations, and Laura, you will know whether this has happened, whether conversations have happened. I would love to see the museum associations, at least in the US, and this includes also the Museum Trustee Association and the Association for Volunteers, come together to develop specific standards related to workplace equity and inclusion, and develop some metrics around this, and really put a push on to elevate as much as possible. And so that's one thing. And I also think that our associations give out a lot of great awards for a lot of great projects and stuff. They need to be given out awards for great workplaces.
Thank you. Colleen is going to be very happy with that in the back here. I know she's in the back, but she's pushing for that same idea. So thank you for that. Micah, what are your recommendations moving forward?
Yeah, well, I hope people can take that this can be done. You know, that all hope is not lost, and it's going to take time. We have to play the long game, but we also have to have a sense of urgency, and we have to approach this through a growth mindset where it's about progress and not about perfection. And gradually things will begin to change. There's a wonderful article with the Stanford Social Innovation Review about the most important characteristic of a leader to successfully effectuate transformational change. And after studying all these organizations, they come to the conclusion that it's moral courage that is the most important characteristic. And I think it's critical to recognize that moral courage does not occur in a vacuum. You can't just ask a leader to stick their neck out and lead the way, and we're going to do this. There has to be an ecosystem around that leadership model through the board and other sort of support systems that really sort of set the stage for the leader to be courageous and to go through this messy process that can be one step forward and two steps back. So I do think, you know, so much of we keep going back to the board, and you know, I really feel strongly that if you change your board, you change your museum, and that we have to start thinking in that mindset.
Thank you. And finally, Laura, what are your recommendations?
Yeah, well, I'll agree with everything Anne and Micah said as well, and just urge everyone, especially who has taken the time out to listen to this webinar today and who will review the data when it's sent out by Museum Expert, to urge you to think about what are the, you know, what is your power in the organization that you can leverage to start the conversations, to continue the conversations, to pull resources. There's a slew of resources that have been shared in the chat today. And I know that's just a fraction of what many of the, both the museum associations and other outside, you know, nonprofit organizations from Board Source to, you know, SHRM, so the Society of Human Resource Management, have available for us to do some of this, you know, proactive culture work in our organizations. And I feel that, you know, leaders certainly have a responsibility, both, you know, in building the boards that they need and in creating the environment in their organizations for this work. And also workers have opportunities and responsibilities, right, to create the culture. A culture isn't created by one person, no matter where they are in the organization. It's a collective of all of the folks who are part of a team and the kind of shared you know, values and shared behaviors of that group. And it changes all the time. It changes with every person that comes, every person that goes, and sort of what is happening, you know, to influence the folks who are there. And so we all have some opportunity and I think responsibility to interrogate what we can do to, you know, to make the changes in our organizations that we want to see.
Thank you so much, three of you, for these first comments on this very brief presentation of the initial results. And as you said, we will share more of that later. I'm going to turn to Staveloz now from Museum Expert to see if we have questions from the audience that we would like to submit to our panelists. Staveloz.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions that I thought were worth highlighting. One from Jennifer Carroll, which was, how do funders, federal grants, foundations, etc., play a role in the leadership feeling that they can't make change? So we talked a lot about the board, but what about some of those funders in there?
Walter, if I could jump, I saw that question go by and I thought it's a great one. That is another thing I think that we could and maybe should be doing, and maybe it could be led by the associations, but we really do need to engage funders in this conversation, both in terms of helping them shape the funding priorities for, what they will, help us to do as individual institutions and as, membership organizations. And then, the feedback that is hard sometimes as a grantee to give to a funder needs to be heard, and that's that too much risk taking when you have a grant, particularly if you're not if you're working your way to get more grants, is really scary. And so people so organizations just won't take the risk. They'll the momentum to sort of follow the lead of what the funder wants to see, and to sometimes contort ourselves in order to get those funds, and to keep it safe so that we can show that we succeeded and get the next one. There's a lot of momentum in that, and I think funders, some might be open to really scrutinizing the structural kind of role that they play in creating that environment and thinking about how they might change it. And some I think actually are, but there's some more work to be done there. It's a great question.
Yeah, I don't know if Anne or Micah want to intervene on this issue here. Do you want, Micah?
Yeah, I'd love to. I mean, I really think what you're saying is right on, Laura. One of our funders, the Compton Foundation, the CEO named June Wilson, has said to me before that typically when things get messy, philanthropy leaves the room. And that, I think, it really discourages leaders from going into these messy, difficult, challenging spaces. And, of course, trust-based philanthropy, as we're trying to make those kinds of shifts, I mean, if you're really looking to leaders to say, we trust you, what do you need? Use the money for what you need. And then the leaders need to say, we need to invest in our people in this sort of inside out way. So I think philanthropy could be a huge ally and partner in all this work, but it too is making this massive transition, kind of turning around the aircraft carrier slowly, but surely there are some strides that are being made as well. So again, I think there's a lot of hope.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I don't know, I want to try to have another question. So maybe,
Okay.
do we have another question?
Go ahead.
So Rebecca had kind of asked a follow-up, but I think you sort of hit on that a little bit in your response there, Micah, about there being a responsibility from the staff, from the higher ups, in terms of how they're communicating with their funders and how they're choosing to allocate the funds. Jose had another question, though, about what role local communities play in the process of museums overcoming the barriers that we've been discussing.
Okay, you can go first.
Okay, well, I think there's a lot of expertise in communities that can help with some of these issues, and so reaching out to people at other nonprofit organizations, in business associations, at colleges and universities. There's a tremendous amount of expertise that, again, it goes to that other issue that was pointed out, that a lot of museums don't kind of poke their head out of the foxhole to see what's out there. Yeah. And so we have to encourage more museums to do that in the first place and take advantage of what's already out there, because I think, as we all know, there's a tremendous amount of expertise related to leadership and organizational culture and organizational change. I mean, nobody has to write a new book on this. It's there. We just need to tap into it and make it our own.
Thank you. And if you all don't mind, I'm going to take this as the last word from the conversation. We are at the end of our hour here, and sorry if we have not addressed everything, but we will certainly in the coming weeks. So I'd like to thank the panelists in the first place for taking this risk of going on the data that we have been collecting and bringing their own perspectives to that. There was certainly a very rich conversation, and only hope that inspires us for next steps where we hopefully can count on you also to be part of that in the future. I'd like to thank the audience today and people who came and asked questions and were active as usual in this. And then finally, I'd like to thank the museum expert staff, Colleen, doing all the work in the background, and Thaddeus for following the chat and all of that. So again, a flawless event thanks to them. So thank you all, and hopefully we meet again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.